Hey, did you see our last episode about mission critical applications? Today, we're going to take it further. We're going to talk about what happens with mission critical applications when you don't run everything in your organization. Join us. Hey, so welcome back to the Azure Enablement Show. Last time we were talking to Martin and Sebastian about mission critical, and we were starting to get deep into stuff, and we were talking about reference architectures. And I was realizing as a customer that the reference architect that we looked at didn't quite match my environment. So we decided we continue with that conversation. So let me switch back to customer mode so we can talk about this some more with Martin and Sebastian. Okay, I'm back as a customer. Let's talk to Martin and Sebastian. Hey folks, it's really great to see you again, and I really appreciate you getting me started in the land of mission critical last time. Where we left off is we went over sort of the basics of mission critical. You were able to tell me about design principles and reference architectures, and we started to get into like, how do I get started? And one of the ways you suggest I get started was looking at the basic reference architecture. We did. But the problem is that reference architecture doesn't exactly match my environment in a couple of ways that I would love to know how to deal with. The first thing that was tricky for me was I have to, in my environment, not just work in the cloud, but I have to connect to some on-premises some on-prem resources. I have this database that cannot go into the cloud. It has to run on-prem. I can't let that data out. So somehow there has to be some connectivity between my mission critical app living in the cloud and my on-prem stuff. So that was thing number one. Thing number two that was also tricky to me is I don't actually control all the things in my environment. I have to kind of live in the space that gets carved out for my group as we build this stuff out. So I'm wondering, is there a reference architecture that takes both of these things into account that we can look at?
Yeah, sure. Lucky for you, there is, because the scenario you just mentioned is what we call typically the landing zone scenario, right? So
Okay.
there's Azure Landing Zones, which more and more organizations adopt to. And this is exactly the case. Like you have a central organization, like what you might call like a platform team, who caters for certain things, right? They, for example, provide identity. They provide networking. And we can talk about your on-prem database in a second. But they also provide you your Azure subscription, for example, or a number of them.
Right.
And that's what we call landing zones. And maybe let's start by looking at the architecture that we looked at last time.
Okay,
So,
this looks familiar.
exactly, this looks familiar, right? So we still have our global resources, we still have our stamp resources. And there are a couple of differences which we can talk about in a second. But to start with, let's actually scroll down here. Because that's the part that's new now, that you didn't see in the baseline architecture last time.
Okay,
so
what am I looking at?
So a couple of things we look at. So the big thing in the middle is what's called the connectivity subscriptions. And that's something that you don't control, right? That's controlled by your platform team. So that's where they might have like a VPN connection or like an express route connection to on-prem. They might have DNS servers in there. They might have firewalls, and all that goodness is in there. And then at the very bottom, you see the on-premise systems. Obviously, that's not a focus here, but it's just important for you to know through that connectivity subscription is how you get like connectivity to, for example, your on-prem database.
Okay, so that makes sense, and it's good to see this stuff. What's the stuff on the side, and what's it doing there? If you want to scroll up just a little bit more, because I noticed we went past it that I hadn't seen before. The boxes that say Bastion and Jump Box and stuff like that, and self-hosted build agents. What's going on with that?
So this is a little different from what we saw before in the online reference implementation. And these are specific management resources which you now will need when you're connected to your connectivity subscription, to your on-premises resources, to your landing zone. And that usually comes with a very specific restrictions on access. So one of the other aspects we covered in the connected reference implementation is that everything is closed down networking-wise. So there's only one entry point to the whole infrastructure from the internet, and that's through front door for the end users. But then no one else, not even administrators, are able to access the environment, such as the AKS cluster, directly, because it's closed down using private links. And for that, for doing deployment and for management tasks, you need special resources on the same network, on the same VNet. So Azure Bastion is used to gain access to basically create like a temporary jump box for your infrastructure so that you can now access your AKS cluster. But then also build agents need to be self-hosted in this scenario because they need to live and sit in the same network as the cluster they're deploying to. So that's why these new resources appeared here, because they're for management and specifically for management of these enclosed resources or non-public resources.
Okay, so the self-hosted build agents make sense to me, right? Because I get the idea that they have to also be able to drop stuff onto the to the stuff there. But what I'm a little fuzzy about is in the last one, much of what they were building onto, we also decided was ephemeral, right? It could just go away, and we could put new ones there. Does that mean that there's some change to ephemerality, if that's a word, how ephemeral things are?
Yes, so we still try to make as many things ephemeral as possible when we talk about the stems. But the one thing that usually can't be ephemeral anymore is the VNet, right? So one of the things when you talk about Azure Landing Zones and those connectivity subscriptions is typically that your platform team will provide you with with pre-provisioned VNets, and there might be peering in place. There will be custom routing rules in place or user-defined routings for your workload to be able to access, for example, what's called the hub and the connectivity subscription, but also then, for example, on-prem resources. And those VNets you just can't destroy every time because your platform team might not like to recreate the peerings all the time for you. So there's a small distinction in there in how we deploy things. Right? In this case, we now need to deploy into existing VNets, and by the time we destroy a stem, we need to clear the VNet and, for example, delete the subnets, but don't delete the entire VNet. But that's exactly one of the things what we call the corrected reference implementation caters for.
Okay, so I have one last question to ask you. So I'm looking at this diagram that has more things on it than the previous diagram, and I'm also noticing that I control less things on this. What does that mean from sort of a reliability perspective if I'm not in control of various things? Like how do I cope with that?
This is a very good realization because suddenly you're not alone in this kind of world and you depend on some other resources which are provided and managed by someone else. And if your application is mission critical, you really need to ensure that all of these dependencies are considered mission critical as well and are designed to be mission critical with all the redundancies in place, with a high focus on reliability, automation, and all of that. So it is very important to align across the organization that everything on which this workload depends is also mission critical.
Okay, cool. Okay, so the last question I have is, last time you told me if I wanted to get into this sort of thing that I could go look at a GitHub repo to see how this would get implemented. Same deal for this reference architecture, and is that what you recommend I do to get started? Where would I get started in addition to the standard documentation?
Yes, indeed. So first of all, we still recommend, like, if you haven't looked at the baseline architecture that we talked about last time yet, go there first, just because it's much easier to wrap your head around things, right, and get started, because you don't have to go through the hoops and, for example, deploying your self-hosted build agents. And as we just saw, like, the architecture still looks the same. But once you've done that, then you can head over to the GitHub repo for the connected reference implementation, and you still find the full getting started guide, the full deployment automation, including the setup of the build agents and management infrastructure there as well. And you can get you started on this one.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Let me switch back to host mode. Okay, back as host. So I just want to thank you, Sebastian. I just want to thank you, Martin. I want to thank everybody for watching this. I hope you will check out the other episodes in the Azure Enablement Show. I hope you'll take a look at the resources we have down below in this video. And I want to thank you all for joining us here on the Azure Enablement Show.